Marcus Thompson's morning routine never varied. At precisely 6:30 a.m., he stood before his bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his crimson silk tie against his crisp white shirt. The morning light streaming through his apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows caught the subtle pattern in the fabric, a graduation gift from his mother that he saved for special days. Today would be one of those days. As the youngest federal prosecutor in the Eastern District's history at 32, Marcus had learned early that appearance mattered almost as much as ability. His pressed charcoal suit, polished Oxford shoes, and the leather briefcase, each element carefully chosen to command respect in a world that sometimes seemed reluctant to give it. The garage of his upscale apartment complex was quiet as his Mercedes purred to life. The car, a recent reward to himself for winning the Morrison case, still had that new car smell he'd grown to love. Marcus smiled at James, the security guard who always worked Tuesday mornings, receiving a cheerful salute in return. "Big day today, Mr. Thompson," James called out, lowering his newspaper. "The Wellington case," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of thorough preparation. 8 months of work finally goes before the grand jury. The morning was pristine, one of those perfect spring days that seemed to hold nothing but promise. Marcus navigated through the tree-lined streets of Oak Brook Hills, mentally rehearsing his opening statement. The Wellington case represented everything he'd worked for, a complex financial fraud scheme that had robbed hundreds of retirees of their savings. Taking down white-collar criminals who thought themselves untouchable was exactly why he'd become a prosecutor. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Praying for you today, baby. Show them what a Thompson can do." Marcus smiled, remembering her sacrifices, working 2 jobs to put him through college, never missing a single mock trial competition. He'd have to remember to send her flowers after court. The classical music playing softly through his car speakers switched to a news update. Marcus reached to change it back just as he entered the small town of Millbrook, a shortcut he'd discovered that saved him 20 minutes on his commute to the federal courthouse. The speed limit dropped from 55 to 35, and Marcus eased off the accelerator accordingly. That's when he saw the flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror. Marcus took a deep breath, already running through his mental checklist. License and registration in the glove compartment, both hands visible on the steering wheel, movements slow and deliberate. The familiar knot formed in his stomach, the one that appeared every time he was pulled over, regardless of his position or achievements. He guided his car to the side of the road, tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. The morning sun caught his law school ring as he carefully turned off the engine. In his rearview mirror, he watched the police officer approach, noting the measured stride, the hand casually resting near the holster, details his years as a prosecutor had taught him to observe. The Wellington case files sat in his briefcase on the passenger seat, 8 months of meticulous work that needed to be presented in less than 2 hours. Marcus glanced at his watch, calculating distances and delays in his head. The knot in his stomach tightened as he lowered his window, preparing for an encounter that would prove far more significant than he could possibly imagine. 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Marcus Thompson stood in Courtroom C of the Millbrook Municipal Building. The space was smaller than the federal courts he usually commanded, with worn wooden benches and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. The morning traffic court docket was packed, the gallery filled with the usual mix of resigned faces and restless bodies. Marcus had debated whether to even contest the ticket. The fine wasn't significant to someone of his means, and his time was valuable. But something about that morning, the officer's dismissive tone, the questionable stop sign violation, didn't sit right with his sense of justice. More importantly, his mother's voice echoed in his head. "If you let the small injustices slide, the big ones will follow." Judge Richard Harrison's reputation preceded him. Known for running an efficient courtroom, he processed traffic violations with assembly line precision. Marcus watched as case after case wrapped up in under 3 minutes each. Guilty, fine. Guilty, increased fine. Guilty with a stern lecture about responsibility. When the clerk called case number 247, Township of Millbrook versus Marcus Thompson, Marcus approached the podium with the same measured confidence he carried in federal court. His shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, the sound drawing a few curious glances from the drowsy gallery. He'd chosen a conservative navy suit today, deliberately leaving his usual power tie at home. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice carrying the perfect mix of respect and authority, "I'd like to present evidence that will clearly demonstrate this citation was issued in error." He reached into his briefcase, removing a sealed envelope containing the traffic camera footage he'd subpoenaed. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his docket. Another supposed stop sign expert. His pen tapped impatiently against the bench. "Do you know how many people come in here claiming they didn't run that stop sign? With all due respect, Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself." Marcus held up the envelope. "The intersection in question is monitored by a traffic camera. I've obtained the footage from the exact time of the alleged violation." A young law intern in the back, who had been nodding off, suddenly sat up straight, her interest piqued by the unusual thoroughness of Marcus's presentation. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus's appearance with a dismissive glance that seemed to linger a beat too long. "Officer Peterson's testimony is clear. He's served this community for 15 years. I don't dispute the officer's service record, Your Honor. I simply ask that you review the actual evidence." The judge's response came swift and sharp. "I've heard enough. This court relies on the trained observation of its officers. The fine is $300, maximum allowed by statute." His gavel fell before Marcus could respond. The intern in the gallery dropped her pen, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the palpable tension in the air. Marcus stood still for a moment, his hand still holding the unopened envelope. In his years of practicing law, he'd learned to read judges, to sense the currents of bias and presumption that sometimes flowed beneath the surface of justice. This was different, more personal, more blatant. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly, his dignity intact despite the judge's dismissal. As he turned to leave, he caught the eye of the young intern, who was hurriedly scribbling notes. At least someone in this courtroom understood what had just transpired. The next case was already being called as Marcus walked out, his unviewed evidence still sealed in its envelope. He had a flight to catch anyway. The Federal Judiciary Excellence Awards were being held that evening, and he had a speech to deliver. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom sparkled with elegant sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathering of the nation's most distinguished legal minds. Judge Richard Harrison adjusted his bow tie in a gilded mirror, pleased with his reflection. After 20 years on the bench, these judiciary events had become routine, but they still carried the weight of importance. He made his way through the crowd, exchanging practiced pleasantries with colleagues. A Supreme Court clerk here, a circuit court judge there. Each conversation a careful dance of professional networking. Harrison prided himself on knowing everyone who mattered in the legal community. "Richard," called out Judge Patricia Martinez, his old law school classmate. "Did you hear who's giving the keynote? The Wellington case prosecutor. Incredible work on that investigation." Harrison nodded, though he hadn't actually followed the case. His municipal court duties kept him busy enough without tracking federal prosecutions. He reached for a champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray, just as the event coordinator approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," she announced, her voice carrying across the murmuring crowd. "We're honored to begin tonight's Federal Judiciary Excellence Awards with our keynote speaker." Harrison settled into his chair at table 4, prime positioning near the front. He unfolded his crisp white napkin, placing it carefully across his lap as the coordinator continued. "Our speaker has recently made headlines for securing indictments in the Wellington financial case, protecting thousands of retirees from one of the largest fraud schemes in our district's history. At 32, he's the youngest federal prosecutor to ever lead a major financial crimes task force. Please welcome the brilliant mind behind the case, Federal Prosecutor Marcus Thompson. The polite applause faltered slightly as Harrison's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, catching the edge of the table before he steadied it. His eyes snapped to the stage, where a familiar figure in an impeccably tailored suit approached the podium. Marcus moved with the same measured confidence he'd shown in traffic court that morning, but now the power he carried was unmistakable. The Navy suit Harrison had dismissed hours earlier took on a different meaning in this light. "Thank you for that warm welcome," Marcus began, his rich voice filling the ballroom. "When we speak about excellence in the judiciary, we must first address the foundation of our legal system: equal justice under law." Harrison felt the color drain from his face as Marcus's gaze swept across the room, pausing for just a fraction of a second on table 4. The morning's traffic court scene played back in his mind, each dismissive word and gesture now magnified by horrifying clarity. Around him, colleagues nodded appreciatively as Marcus wove together stories of justice and accountability. He spoke about the Wellington case with passion and precision, detailing how his team had uncovered layers of financial manipulation. Harrison barely heard the words, his mind stuck on the sealed envelope of evidence he'd refused to even consider. "In our pursuit of justice," Marcus continued, "we must remember that every case, no matter how small, deserves our full attention and fair consideration. True excellence in the judiciary isn't measured by the size of the case, but by our commitment to viewing each piece of evidence, hearing each argument, and treating each person before us with equal respect." The irony of those words struck Harrison like a physical blow. As applause erupted around him, he remained seated, his hands heavy in his lap, the weight of his morning's actions pressing down on him like lead. The courthouse parking lot was empty except for Judge Harrison's black sedan, its presence marked by a single cone space reserved for judiciary members. The building's security lights cast long shadows across the asphalt as midnight approached. Inside his chambers, Harrison sat at his desk, his bow tie undone and hanging loosely around his neck. The sealed envelope from the morning's traffic court lay before him, finally opened. On his computer screen, the traffic camera footage played for the 7th time. Marcus Thompson's Mercedes came to a complete stop at the intersection, waiting the required 3 seconds before proceeding. The evidence was undeniable. Harrison rubbed his temples, the evening's events replaying in his mind. After Marcus's keynote speech, he'd slipped away from the award ceremony, unable to face the networking hour. The drive back to his chambers had been a blur of self-examination and growing discomfort. "Judge?" The voice startled him. Earl, the night janitor, stood in the doorway with his cleaning cart. "Didn't expect anyone here this late." "Just reviewing some cases, Earl," Harrison replied, his voice rough from hours of silence. The clock on his wall read 11:47 p.m. "Must be important to keep you here past the game." "Wildcats won tonight," Earl offered, before continuing down the hallway, the wheels of his cart squeaking against the polished floor. Harrison had forgotten about the basketball game. The first time in 15 years he'd missed watching his alma mater play. Instead, he'd spent the evening pulling files, reviewing his recent cases with new eyes. The patterns he discovered made his stomach churn. He opened his court management software, filtering cases from the past 6 months. The data told a story he'd never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to see. His fines averaged 23% higher for certain defendants, his benefit of the doubt notably absent in particular cases. The numbers couldn't be explained away by circumstance or coincidence. A stack of case files sat on his desk, post-it notes marking passages where he'd made snap judgments. How many times had he, like today, dismissed evidence without proper review? How many times had his preconceptions colored his decisions? His computer pinged with an email notification. The Federal Bar Association newsletter featured a photo from the evening's event, Marcus Thompson at the podium, commanding the room's attention. The caption detailed his impressive career: Harvard Law Review, clerkship with the D.C. Circuit, youngest federal prosecutor in the district's history. Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out the morning's traffic court notes. His handwriting seemed foreign now. Defendant argumentative. Questions officer's judgment. He'd written those words before Marcus had even finished presenting his case. The security lights outside flickered, catching his attention. Earl was finishing his rounds, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the windows. Dawn wasn't far away, and Harrison had barely moved from his desk all night. He reached for his phone, opening a blank email. The cursor blinked accusingly as he typed, deleted, and retyped the opening lines. How does one begin to address such a profound error in judgment? What words could adequately convey both apology and acknowledgement? As the first hints of morning light crept into his chambers, Harrison finally began to write, not just an apology to Marcus Thompson, but a commitment to himself, a pledge to examine his beliefs, his practices, and the subtle biases that had infiltrated his courtroom without his conscious awareness. The morning cleaning crew would find him there, surrounded by files and data, still working to understand how he'd allowed himself to stray so far from the principles of justice he'd sworn to uphold. Marcus Thompson's corner office in the federal building offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the numerous awards and certificates that lined his walls. His assistant, Sarah, entered with the day's mail, placing it carefully on his desk beside a stack of briefs from the Wellington case. "The grand jury transcripts are ready for review," Sarah said, pausing before adding, "And there's a personal letter here, hand-delivered this morning." Marcus looked up from his computer screen, noting the cream-colored envelope with its precise handwriting. No return address, but the quality of the stationery spoke of significance. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper between his fingers. "Also," Sarah continued, her tone careful, "Judge Harrison's office called 3 times since yesterday." Marcus's hand stilled over the envelope. He'd successfully avoided thinking about the traffic court incident, channeling his energy into the Wellington case instead. The grand jury had returned all 47 indictments he'd sought, a career-defining victory that should have occupied all his thoughts. What did his office want? Marcus asked, maintaining his usual composed demeanor. "He's requesting a meeting." His clerk emphasized it was a personal matter, not professional. Sarah hesitated. "Should I continue to say you're in court?" Marcus turned the envelope over, recognizing the seal of the municipal court on the back. "No," he said after a moment. "Let's see what he has to say first." He gestured to the letter. Alone in his office, Marcus opened the envelope with his sterling silver letter opener, a graduation gift from his mother. The letter inside was handwritten, the penmanship revealing careful consideration of each word. "Dear Mr. Thompson, the events of last Tuesday have forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my conduct on the bench. Your traffic court appearance, followed by your exemplary keynote address, created a stark contrast that has haunted my thoughts. I've spent the past several days reviewing my recent cases, discovering patterns that shame me both as a judge and as a human being. While I cannot undo past decisions, I can acknowledge my errors and commit to change. I would appreciate the opportunity to apologize to you in person, not in my chambers or your office, but on neutral ground. There's a small coffee shop, the Daily Grind, near the federal courthouse. I often see you there during lunch hours. If you're willing, I would be grateful for 30 minutes of your time. With sincere regret and hope for dialogue. Richard Harrison." Marcus placed the letter on his desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Through his window, he could see the Daily Grind across the street, its morning crowd forming the usual line out the door. He'd chosen that coffee shop specifically because it was Black-owned, supporting local businesses being another lesson his mother had instilled in him. Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Judge Harrison's clerk is on line 1. Again." Marcus looked at the letter, then at his reflection in the window. His mother had taught him something else too, that true strength sometimes lies in allowing others the chance to make things right. He pressed the intercom button. "Sarah, please tell the clerk I've received the judge's letter." And Sarah, "Call the Daily Grind. Reserve their corner table for tomorrow at 10 a.m. 2 people." The daily grind hummed with its usual morning energy, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans filling the air. At precisely 9:55 a.m., Marcus Thompson entered, nodding to Ms. Regina, the owner, who had known him since his first day as a prosecutor. She gestured toward the corner table, already set with 2 cups of his usual order, Ethiopian light roast, black. The corner table offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Marcus chose the seat facing the door, a habit from his years in the courtroom. Always be prepared, always maintain awareness. He pulled out his phone, not to check messages, but to give his hand something to do. At 10 o'clock a.m. sharp, Judge Richard Harrison walked in. He'd foregone his usual judicial attire for a casual blazer and slacks, though his posture still carried the weight of his office. Ms. Regina's usual warm greeting was noticeably cooler as she pointed him toward Marcus's table. "Mr. Thompson," Harrison said, his voice carrying none of its previous courtroom authority, "thank you for agreeing to meet." Marcus gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit down. The coffee here is excellent." They sat in silence for a moment, both men studying their cups as if they might find the right words swirling in the dark liquid. The morning rush flowed around them. Students with laptops, professionals on conference calls, the regular rhythm of the espresso machine punctuating the air. "I spent 17 hours reviewing cases after that award ceremony," Harrison finally began, his fingers wrapped around his untouched cup. 17 hours confronting patterns I should have seen years ago. Marcus remained silent, giving the judge the space to continue. A skill his mother had taught him. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. "I found 43 cases in the past 6 months alone where I dismissed evidence without proper review," Harrison continued. 43 times I let preconceptions overshadow procedure." He paused, meeting Marcus's gaze directly. "Your case was 44. The espresso machine hissed, and Ms. Regina's voice called out an order number. Life continued around their bubble of conversation. "When I saw you at that podium," Harrison said, "I realized I wasn't just wrong about a traffic violation. I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about administering justice." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Justice isn't about what we think we know, Your Honor. It's about what we can prove, what we can show, what we can demonstrate beyond our assumptions." "Please," Harrison said, "call me Richard." He finally took a sip of his coffee, eyebrows raising in surprise at the quality. "This is excellent." "Ms. Regina has been perfecting her roasts for 20 years, Marcus replied. "She started this shop when the neighborhood had nothing. People told her it wouldn't work, that she should move to a better area. She proved them all wrong." Harrison glanced toward the counter, seeing Ms. Regina in a new light. "We see what we expect to see," he said quietly, "until something forces us to look closer." "Or someone," Marcus added, taking another sip of his coffee. Their conversation continued, moving beyond apology into deeper waters, discussions of systemic change, of conscious awareness, of the daily choices that shape justice. When Ms. Regina brought them fresh cups, unasked, both men noticed she was smiling now, the coffee shop's morning symphony playing on around them. 3 months after their coffee shop meeting, Courtroom C had transformed. The same fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, but the atmosphere was distinctly different. Judge Harrison sat at his bench, reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully reviewed a stack of evidence photos from a minor fender bender. "Please proceed with your explanation," he said to the nervous teenager at the podium, his tone encouraging rather than dismissive. The gallery, usually restless during traffic court, paid attention as the young driver walked the judge through her account of the accident. Among the observers sat Lisa Chen, the law intern who had witnessed Marcus Thompson's traffic court appearance. Now a regular visitor to Harrison's courtroom, she furiously scribbled notes about the judge's transformed approach to justice. "Your Honor," the city prosecutor interjected, given the officer's report. Harrison raised his hand gently. "Let's review all the evidence before making determinations, Counselor." He turned back to the teenager. "You mentioned there were security cameras at the gas station nearby." The morning proceeded at a more measured pace than before. Each case received full attention. Every piece of evidence examined. Every statement considered. The lines moved slower, but the faces leaving the courtroom showed something rare in traffic court: a sense of being heard. During the morning recess, Harrison noticed a familiar figure slip into the back row. Marcus Thompson, taking notes of his own. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Later that afternoon, Harrison sat in his chambers with the courthouse's chief judge, Catherine Martinez. "Your clearance rate has dropped 40%, she noted, reviewing the monthly statistics. "But our appeal rate has dropped 70%, Harrison countered, sliding another report across his desk. "And community satisfaction surveys show a marked improvement." Martinez leaned back, studying him. "I've been hearing interesting things about your courtroom, Richard. The law schools are sending students to observe. The Bar Association is taking notice." Harrison smiled, remembering his own words from years ago about running an efficient courtroom. "I'd rather be known for running a fair one," he replied. As if on cue, his clerk entered with the afternoon docket. A note was paper-clipped to the front, a request from the State Judicial College to develop a training program on courtroom bias awareness. It would mean extra hours, weekend work, a complete restructuring of his schedule. Harrison thought about the teenager from that morning, how her shoulders had relaxed when she realized she would truly be heard. He thought about Marcus Thompson's words over coffee. "Change isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small decisions we make every day." "Sarah," he called to his clerk, "please contact the Judicial College. I'll need to review their training materials." He paused, then added, "and reach out to Federal Prosecutor Thompson's office. This program should have multiple perspectives." As the afternoon session began, Harrison noticed more faces in his gallery: law students, local attorneys, even a reporter from the legal newspaper. His courtroom had become a kind of laboratory for change, each case an opportunity to demonstrate what justice could look like when prejudgment was replaced with genuine consideration. "Next case," he announced, settling his glasses on his nose. In the back row, Lisa Chen readied her notebook, knowing that today's proceedings would provide more lessons in the evolution of justice. 1 year later, the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom was filled once again with the nation's finest legal minds. This time, however, Marcus Thompson and Judge Richard Harrison stood together at the podium, launching their innovative mentorship program, Justice Forward. The program paired experienced judges with young legal professionals from diverse backgrounds, creating bridges across experiences that might never otherwise connect. In the audience, Lisa Chen, now a first-year associate at a prestigious firm, sat beside Ms. Regina from the Daily Grind, both specially invited to witness this moment. "When I first met Judge Harrison," Marcus began, a subtle smile playing at his lips, "it wasn't under the best circumstances." A knowing chuckle rippled through those familiar with their story. "But what happened next proved something crucial about our justice system. It can evolve when people are willing to face uncomfortable truths." Harrison stepped forward, his posture relaxed yet dignified. "Mr. Thompson taught me that true justice requires more than just following procedures. It demands that we examine our assumptions, challenge our perspectives, and remain open to growth." The presentation screen behind them displayed statistics from Harrison's transformed courtroom. Dramatically reduced appeal rates, improved community trust scores, and a new record for case satisfaction ratings. But more telling were the faces in the audience: young legal professionals of all backgrounds, sitting alongside veteran judges who had signed up for the mentorship program. "Today," Marcus continued, "we're not just launching a program. We're creating opportunities for connection, understanding, and growth within our legal community. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be seen, heard, and judged fairly, not based on assumptions, but on evidence and truth." After the presentation, Marcus found his mother in the crowd, her eyes shining with pride. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "Look how far we've come." Nearby, Harrison was deep in conversation with a group of law students, including one who reminded him of himself 30 years ago. At the reception that followed, Ms. Regina had insisted on catering the coffee service herself, setting up an elegant pour-over station that drew admirers from across the legal community. Lisa Chen circulated through the crowd, collecting business cards and sharing her first-hand account of witnessing the stories beginning in traffic court. "Your Honor," a young public defender approached Harrison. "Your recent paper on courtroom bias transformation has become required reading in our office." Harrison smiled, remembering his own journey. "The real education happens in the daily choices we make. Speaking of which," he gestured to Marcus, who was approaching with 2 fresh cups of Ms. Regina's coffee. The 2 men found a quiet moment away from the crowd, just as they had that first morning at the daily grind. "Did you ever think," Harrison asked, "that a traffic ticket would lead to all this?" Marcus watched the room full of judges and young lawyers engaging in earnest conversation. "Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes. My mother always said that." "Wise woman." Harrison nodded, sipping his coffee. "She raised an extraordinary son." As the evening wound down, a young law student approached Marcus for advice. Harrison watched as Marcus gave the student his full attention, just as he had done with every case in his federal prosecutor role. The cycle of mentorship was already beginning. The program they launched that day would go on to transform hundreds of careers and impact thousands of lives. But perhaps more importantly, it stood as proof that justice, at its heart, is about the willingness to grow, to learn, and to see each person who steps into a courtroom as worthy of complete and fair consideration.